Hello, my name is Dorothea Jensen, and I live here in Hopkinton. And at the beginning of the month, I did a Zoom call with the Hopkinton Historical Society, along with my colleague and friend, Mr. Julien Nichet, who is the founder and the president of the Lafayette Trail, Inc. I sit on the board of this nonprofit. Anyway, the Zoom call, due to a technological snafu, was not recorded. Luckily, I had some very definite points set out that I followed, so I'm able to recreate what I said pretty accurately. I thought it was important to explain to the people of Hopkinton what the new sign in the middle of Hopkinton Village is all about. First, I will talk about how I became interested in Lafayette. I moved to Hopkinton in 1991, but I didn't find out until 6 years later that the world-famous Revolutionary War General Lafayette actually visited this town on June 27th, 1825. In fact, it wasn't until that time, 1997, that I even knew that he had come to America in the 19th century, let alone his stop in Hopkinton. Then I met an elderly woman who was probably younger than I am now, but I considered her elderly at the time. She told me that her great-grandmother, as a little girl, had been selected by the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, where she lived, to present a posy to Lafayette when he came through on his farewell tour in June of 1824. So she gave him the posy, and he gave her a kiss on the cheek, which at that time was referred to as a buss on the cheek. My new friend, Rita, her name was Rita Nash Payne, she told me that this kiss had been deliberately passed down in the family. Her great-grandmother, as an old lady, had kissed Rita's mother, and then later, of course, Rita's mother gave her a kiss saying, "This is from Lafayette." So, of course, the first thing I did was ask Rita to kiss me on the cheek, and she did. So that was how I learned Lafayette had been traveling around America 50 years after the beginning of the Revolution. And I started reading about his farewell tour at that time, 1997. And I found out that not only had he visited Hopkinton, but that afterwards he had gone right by my house on Route 103 here in Hopkinton. Now, soon after that, I discovered this old marker in Hopkinton Village, which shows the date of his visit as June 22nd, 1825. Now, because of all my research, I knew that on June 22nd, 1825, Lafayette was not in Hopkinton. He was in Concord, where he was welcomed by a parade, an appearance before the legislature, a meeting with 200 Revolutionary War veterans, many of whom had fought under him, and a number of whom he called by name. He recognized and remembered their names. There was also a sit-down dinner for 600 on the State House lawn, and toasts and speeches and songs, and one of the songs that was sung, composed for the occasion, referred to New Hampshire for the very first time as the Granite State. Now, this was all very well documented. So the old marker was wrong. Now, I'm guessing that this incorrect date came from Lord's Life and Times in Hopkinton, in which he reports that the village school teacher, Betsy Eaton, brought her students to see Lafayette under the elms in front of the Wiggins Tavern, which was more or less between where the Episcopal Church is now and the house that's next door to it. You can see there's a bit of a space in there. The church wasn't there yet. Anyway, apparently, according to Lord, Betsy Eaton made a memorandum in her dictionary in which she said, June 22nd, 1825, keeping school in the village this summer, and Esquire Chase called at the door, saying Lafayette was here, and he wished me to dismiss the school so that we might all have the pleasure of shaking hands with so distinguished a personage. So the date error was either Betsy's fault or Lord wrote it down wrong for the book when he put it all together. But in any case, it really has bugged me for 24 years. But it also started me thinking about people who lived here at that time and why they went to see him when he was in our town. I ended up writing a historical novel for middle and high schoolers about a fictional girl living here in Hopkinton at that time who met and was quite possibly kissed or bussed by Lafayette on that day. My novel, which I titled A Bus from Lafayette, came out in 2016. In 2015, I joined an organization called the American Friends of Lafayette, where I met a very young Frenchman named Julien Ichet on the Yorktown battlefield. Ichet later became officially connected with the French consulate for New England, and his mission was tracking and documenting where Lafayette went on his farewell tour in New England. On April 9th, 2017, I showed Julian the old incorrect marker in Hopkinton Village. We agreed it should be replaced by a correct one ASAP. Well, it's taken 4 years, but almost exactly 4 years later, on Wednesday, May 5th, that finally happened. So today I am going to talk about Lafayette's farewell tour, about Lafayette himself, and about his stop here in our town of Hopkinton, New Hampshire. So first of all, I'd like to explain a little about how the farewell tour came about. The presidential election of 1824 was every bit as rancorous and divisive as our recent election. People were furious on both sides of the divide. The two candidates were John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And because neither of them got the required electoral college votes, it ended up in Congress, and Congress voted to make John Quincy Adams the president, and people were really angry all over the United States. At that point, the sitting president, President Monroe, for various reasons, decided that a visit from Lafayette might be a very healing thing to do. So he invited Lafayette to come visit America. And this tour, which was originally going to be quite limited, ended up encompassing all 24 of the states that were then in the Union. Now, these 24 states are now 25 because of West Virginia's splitting off from Virginia during the Civil War. Lafayette, who had had a fairly negative experience with the French Revolution, he ended up in prison for 5 years. And he was not a popular figure in France at that time because he advocated a middle-of-the-road approach to the revolution. He thought that the king should be kept, but that he should be corralled. In other words, there should be a representative body, sort of like Parliament, controlling the power of the king. Well, the people on the streets hated this idea, and the people who were monarchists hated this idea. So there wasn't a huge majority of people who were standing up and saying, "Oh, yay, Lafayette, you've got the right idea." In any case, he had had a terrible time. So when he was invited to come to America, it was a healing experience for him too, because he was visiting the triumphs of his youth. He was made a major general for various political reasons at the age of 19, which is highly unusual to say the least. So he was in his late 60s, and as such, he was the only major general from the revolution, I believe, on either side, who was still alive. So he was looked at by the people that he visited in America as a living link to a very important part of our past. Everybody knew he had been a very good friend of George Washington, and George Washington had died 25 years before. Everywhere that Lafayette went, he was welcomed like a rock star. There were mobs and mobs of people who turned out to see him. It's estimated that 1/4 of the population of the United States, something like 3 million people, turned out to see him on his farewell tour. So before I talk any further about Lafayette's stop in Hopkinton, I thought I might remind you of who he was and how he helped us win independence and why so many people flocked to see him 50 years later. So this is going to be a sort of nutshell edition of things that he did to help us, because I believe, and many others agree with me, that if it weren't for Lafayette, we might very well have lost our revolution. I decided to use bits of my new book, Liberty-Loving Lafayette, How America's Favorite Fighting Frenchman Helped Win Our Independence, to tell this story. Now, I wrote this during the pandemic, and it's in rhyming verse, inspired by, obviously, the Broadway musical Hamilton, as well as Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which I had to memorize in 5th grade, quite a few years ago now. I think this poetry offers pretty succinct explanations of how Lafayette helped us, so I'll be plugging in bits of it here and there. It starts like this. So listen up, my children, and I'll do my best to tell how a teenaged French aristocrat served all of us so well. Without his help, we might have lost our fight for liberty, and we'd still be lowly subjects of the British monarchy. So here are the bare bones of this teenaged French aristocrat's role in our revolution. Marie-Joseph-Paul Yves Roche, Gilbert du Mortier de Lafayette, called Gilbert by his friends, was a French marquis, an aristocratic rank above an earl or a count, but below a duke. This meant that he knew the French royals and many powerful aristocrats, although he detested life at the court, and aristocrats were expected to spend most of their time at the court, fawning on the royals and the other aristocrats, which just wasn't Gilbert's style at all. His father was killed by the British during the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, when Lafayette was a toddler. He had no memory of his father. He came from a family in which there was a tradition of serving in the French military, going all the way back to the Crusades. His schooling focused on military training, and he joined the Musketeers, but he did not, however, experience any combat. When he was still quite young, Gilbert inherited immense family wealth, which made him one of the richest men in France. He was wed at 16, that's 16, to a 14-year-old bride named Adrienne, who was a duke's daughter. Now, although this was arranged by their families, it turned out to be quite a happy marriage. At age 17, Lafayette happened to dine with George III's younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, who disagreed with the king's treatment of the American colonies. After hearing that the colonists were fighting for independence, as he said afterwards, Lafayette's heart was enlisted in the American cause. Here's how I put it in my poem. Young Lafayette had dinner with the British king's beau, who told him the Americans were good to go. Just as soon as he found out about our fight for liberty, a flame was set alight inside this starry-eyed marquis. He later met with American agent Silas Deane in Paris, who offered him a commission as a Major General in the Continental Army. Now, the only person in the Army who had a higher rank at that point was George Washington. So you can see that Major General was a very high rank, especially for a 19-year-old. Despite opposition by the King of France and his powerful father-in-law, Lafayette bought a ship, named it the Victory, and sailed to America. Here's how I put it in my poem. Lafayette had feelings complicated at this point in life. Should he go fight with Washington or stay with doting wife? But the chance of glory beckoned, not to mention liberty, compelling him to join our fray from far across the sea. So when the King of France said he'd be subject to arrest, he sneaked aboard the Victory and headed to the west. He endured the trip across despite some nasty mal de mer and learned a bit of English by the time he landed there. He arrived in Philadelphia to a less than enthusiastic reception by Congress, and there was a good reason for that. Silas Deane had given way too many people high ranks, people who didn't really merit such a rank, and many of them showed up expecting to be given high wages and a big command. But Lafayette eventually, with the epistolary support of Silas Deane and Ben Franklin, who wrote letters from Paris, he was appointed aide-de-camp to Washington and made a major general, but was given no troops to command. After that, Lafayette and Washington became very close friends and remained so for the rest of their lives. Now, this gave great support to Washington during many difficult moments in the Revolution to have such a close friend. Lafayette was wounded in the leg at the Battle of Brandywine, his first combat experience, at which he showed bravery and cool-headedness under fire. He had no troops officially under his command, but he rallied those who weren't. He was finally given command of a division, a huge responsibility for such a young man. And this is how that came about. Through General Greene, whom I'm happy to say is a shirt-tail ancestor of mine. Greene gave him his first command of anything, just a few hundred men, but it was a command. Greene sent him out to skirmish and to scout the British forces to see how many men there were, and armaments and horses. Near Gloucester, in the Jerseys, lurked a Hessian company. The young Marquis attacked them and achieved a victory. Greene said he searched for danger when the facts of this were known, and Lafayette was given a division of his own. Lafayette spent the winter at Valley Forge, but then he was sent to attack Canada over the objections of Washington. This was done by the War Board, which had been set up by Congress to oversee and more or less control Washington. And there was a bit of a movement to try and replace Washington with General Gates, the so-called hero of Saratoga. That was called the Conway Cabal. He went along to Valley Forge, enduring cold and damp, and worked with Hamilton as the commander's aides-de-camp. His wit and charm kept spirits up for officers and all, and he helped reveal to Washington the dread Conway Cabal. The plotters launched another plan to try and split asunder young Lafayette and Washington, but 'twas another blunder. For when they sent the Frenchman north with Canada the aim, it didn't take him long to see the whole idea was lame. At Albany, he learned that troops, supplies, and funds were lacking. All three were indispensable for powerful attacking. 'Twas clear to Lafayette that this invasion plan would fizzle, so he hastened back to Valley Forge, despite the snow and drizzle. After the British occupation of Philadelphia ended, Lafayette fought with distinction at the Battle of Monmouth. He was supposed to be the field commander that day, but unfortunately was supplanted by the more senior General Lee, whom we found out much, much later had entertained his British captors when he was a POW for over a year, and he spent his time entertaining the British officers by coming up with great plans for them to defeat the Americans. Then when the Brits left Philly and hightailed it out of town, it wasn't until Monmouth that our forces chased them down. Brave Lafayette stood ready to command our troops that day, but General Lee took precedence, so led the battle fray. Then messed it up completely when he ordered a retreat, and all thought Lafayette should have been in the driver's seat. Lafayette effectively led his division at Newport, the first battle in which our new allies, the French, were on the scene. The British had captured Newport earlier in the war, and the American forces were trying to take it back under the command of General Sullivan from New Hampshire. Unfortunately, it didn't work out very well, so Lafayette was enlisted to smooth things over between the French and the American commanders. General Sullivan was writing nasty letters to everybody he could think of about Admiral d'Estaing and the French in general, and it wasn't doing anybody any good. When finally ships from France arrived to lend us their support, their Admiral d'Estaing was sent to help attack Newport. But egos came in conflict when the battle was begun, and the French fleet sailed away before a victory was won. The Marquis was recruited then to act as go-between, to help smooth ruffled feathers and make everything serene. After the problems at Newport, Lafayette went back to France to ask for significantly more support for America. This blundering, however, showed we needed something more to fix up the alliance and ensure we'd win the war. So Lafayette sailed back to France and hounded king and court to send more soldiers and more ships to beef up French support. And in the end, France doubled down against the British foe. She sent more troops and ships and guns and also Rochambeau. After Lafayette returned to America, he led troops, which he helped outfit from his own pocket, into Virginia. There he managed to evade the much larger forces of the British until he trapped General Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown. For he bottled up Cornwallis at Virginia's town of York, and then de Grasse's fleet arrived to place the crucial cork. By pinning down the British in the fall of '81, Gilbert set up the scene for independence to be won. Finally, Lafayette played a significant role in the last major battle of the war at Yorktown. When Washington appeared with men, materiel, and horses, he put the boy in charge of nearly 1/3 of his forces. Thus, on the Yorktown battlefield, our favorite Marquis performed a starring role to win this final victory. So raise a cheer for Lafayette, who so loved liberty. Without him, we would not have won our independency. So, that's a nutshell explanation of some of what Lafayette did in our revolution, including 1, his skillful service as a continental officer. 2, his coordination of French and American military efforts. 3, his great success in securing additional aid from France. And 4, his great friendship with Washington and other founding fathers. So even this brief summary shows what a huge contribution Lafayette made to our fight for independence. And because in the early 1800s, people remembered all that, they turned out in droves to see him on his farewell tour, even here in Hopkinton. Now I'll talk a little bit about what happened when Lafayette stopped here in Hopkinton. After the big reception in Concord on the 22nd, he traveled to Maine. He went up to Portland, Maine, and then he came back. He stayed overnight in Northwood. You'll see a sign right there in Northwood that he stayed overnight there. And then he came back to Concord to get ready for his trip to Vermont, going on with his tour. And apparently there was a big brouhaha. There were 2 coach companies, and they were arguing over which one would have the honor of driving the coach that Lafayette was in. And after a considerable amount of argumentation, it was decided that one coach company would supply the horses and another one would supply the drivers. So that's how they worked out a compromise. Anyway, so he came along, he left in late morning and was driving along, basically along Hopkinton Road. When he arrived at the border of Hopkinton, there was a gaggle of town officials who were waiting there for him. And they said to him, "Please, we have many people who would like to shake your hand. Will you please stop in Hopkinton so that we can do so and greet you?" And that's what he did. They all then traveled into Hopkinton Village, where there was a crowd of people waiting under the elm trees in front of Wiggins Tavern, including, of course, Betsy Eaton and her students. And that would be the Betsy who didn't know what day it was, apparently. So he did stop there, and he did talk to the people, and he did shake hands with many, many, many of them before he got back in his carriage, and he went on his way towards Vermont. So that was his stop in Hopkinton, And he did it at the request of the town fathers and people, as you can see by what Betsy did have to say about him, that he was a distinguished personage and shaking hands was the order of the day, that this was a really big deal for the people of Hopkinton. So that is why the new sign is there with the correct date. And I am so pleased that I can now sleep nights because I'm no longer irritated every time I go through Hopkinton Village. I'm also, by the way, on the committee of the American Friends of Lafayette, planning a bicentennial celebration of Lafayette's farewell tour, which will, of course, be in 2024-25. And I'm looking for people who might be interested in working on that event. It should be a lot of fun. We want to involve the kids, the students in the high school and the middle school and the lower school, possibly have a competition of people reading my poem, 2 lines at a time, whatever. And arts and crafts and making fans and so forth that were sold as souvenirs, that kind of thing. So if you would be interested, please send me a quick email at jensendorothea@gmail.com. Or if you have any more questions about Lafayette or his stop in Hopkinton, I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you very much. Viva Lafayette!